This story is about a personal journey of mine of faith and how that was linked with my work as a young physicist. The year was 1992. I was having a wonderful conversation in front of our Student Center coffee house and donut shop at MIT. And I was discussing with another scientist our research work, which included energy, the beginnings of the universe, the Big Bang. It was a great conversation until I mentioned in that conversation my belief in God. That was a conversation stopper, literally. This scientist did not know what to say. He was so taken back that he found another scientist who actually was doing fundamental work on the creation and believed in God. It didn't make sense to him. So he just stared at me and said, "You must be a mutant." Well, I kind of laughed a little bit, and I think he felt he stepped over the line just a bit, so he reached out to console me. I forgot he was eating a jelly donut and started wiping jelly all over my coat. I've been called extraterrestrial, and a few other names, but I realize that in the scientific community it is difficult to talk about God and science in the same sentence. It's sometimes considered an oxymoron. Thinking gets very blurry very quickly in these conversations. It reminds me of a famous letter written to a young church in Italy, and I heavily paraphrase here, but it says that what can be known about God is already obvious to us, but because of the things that we allow into our lives and the amount of noise we bring into our minds, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to think clearly about the topic. That letter is really about clear thinking. And for me, it's more than that. It's also about reducing noise. Of course, all of us want to be clear thinkers, don't we? So this is where it kind of began, a few years before that, in 1984. Here I was, with a bit more hair, tweaking knobs in my very first major physics experiment. My mentor was this very interesting gentleman. His quest was to build an apparatus that would be so sensitive that it could detect the minute vibrations set up by colliding black holes, literally millions of light years away. Now, you've probably heard of black holes. At the time, these were still considered hypothetical objects. Well, a few years before this, another handsome gentleman with even more hair, of course, Albert Einstein, formulated his general theory of relativity. Out of that theory came some of the most bizarre things, including black holes. So when a star approaches the end of its life and has burned most of its hydrogen and lighter elements through nuclear fusion, there's no longer the thermal pressure available to keep that star from collapsing through gravitational force. It collapses down to a single point, a singularity. I'll show you a picture of what one of these looks like, an artist version of this. Black holes, singularities, are so powerful, nothing can escape them, not even light. You can even see the curvature of space being so distorted by these things. In the center of our galaxy, stellar populations are so numerous that it's quite probable that two of these things can actually come together, orbit in a disintegrating orbit, and actually collide. It's a little bit, imagine taking a large rock and throwing it into a smooth pond. Circular waves would emanate from the splash point. Black holes, or orbiting and colliding black holes, unlike water waves created, these are actually refractions and contractions of space and time themselves. These things are generated in an enormous energy wave, and they leave the center of galaxies or other galaxies, and they travel, when they reach to the Earth, they're so weak that it takes an incredibly powerful and sensitive detector to find these things. But that was my assignment, and I set out to do that. Now, I sat next to my mentor. I remember his simple desk with his pipe at his hand, and he instructed me what I needed to do. I needed to develop and build an apparatus that would reduce the noise on our prototype gravity antenna. It was built in an old building that was poorly insulated from outside noise near noisy and busy Technology Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Trucks would drive by and shake the ground. All that shaking and vibration had to be minimized to an absolute nearly zero if we had even a chance of detecting gravity waves. That was my assignment. Well, while I was trying to figure out how to reduce noise in the laboratory, I was also trying to figure out God. And that was a big task to take on, because in the mid-1980s, there was a culture war brewing in the United States, one between the communities of the academics and religion. That culture war really didn't exist before, and it has been growing ever since to create really a gaping chasm between the two communities today. There was a lot of noise, metaphorically speaking, generated by that war. On the religious side, I remember the great public debate of prayer in the public school. That created a lot of noise, and where you landed on that debate could create a lot of friction, actually. There was a lot of noise across our TV screens and the media. We saw scandals and vices of the religious leaders constantly draped across our TV screens. There was a mockery of God. That created a lot of noise. And of course, in the published media, I remember visiting different bookstores on campus and around town. It seemed like religion, or God, was getting more interested in prosperity and blessings for profit. You could have a great, wonderful life, accumulate wealth, and do all these great things, of course, as long as you supported this or that ministry, or this or that minister, more particularly. And there was a lot of noise out there, and I think if you didn't have the wherewithal, you would get lost in all this. Of course, our politics and religion was another thing. That created a lot of noise. And I don't think this started in the 1980s, but it's where I remember it for the first time. We seem to laud and judge our leaders, not so much for how they conducted their lives, but more on how they held up the Bible and waved it around. It was difficult to get through that noise. And if it was noisy in the religious community, it was ear-deafening in the scientific community. Scientists would very frequently voice their anti-God opinions in our lecture halls. I remember one famous scientist, you might have heard of him, Stefan Hawkins. He came to our lecture hall in the mid-1980s. His view on all this is the philosophy of naturalism. That is, everything could ultimately be attributed to pure random chance, even though I believe it takes a lot of faith to believe the astronomically small probabilities for random chance to work and for us to be here. And ironically, he's kind of viewed as a demagogue too, so that's something to think about. You know, there were scientists who sincerely did believe in God, but they never voiced their thoughts unless I prompted them for a dialogue, which I did occasionally because I was interested in figuring things out. And I was never convinced by arguments on either side, religious or scientific, and how and why we got here. There were either shortcut arguments or condescending views, and it just didn't make it for me. I simply wasn't interested. So what I did is I went around and visited different churches, and not knowing kind of where to go, I just went to different ones. There's a lot of choices to choose from, denominations, white, black, brown churches. It was confusing because each church seemed to say that they were carriers of the truth, even though they differed greatly on their fundamental doctrines, all of which came from the same place. That didn't make a lot of sense to me. And when I talked to people, it was also confusing because I remember asking and interviewing people why they actually went, and there was never really a good answer apart from my family always went. My grandparents, my parents, I always went, I better always go, ... I was not convinced. The best conversation I had was with another fellow physics student. He was from Eastern Europe. He was a complete atheist. But when we got tired of our quantum homework, we would get in these great discussions about God. And I remember him telling me, stop your Sunday morning journeys, stay in bed, relax, get ready for the week. After some time, I had to kind of believe him because I wasn't making much progress out there. Taking that path didn't help much either, but I was still interested in doing something, so what I ended up doing was just visiting churches less and less and reading the Bible more and more. I tried to read it in high fidelity. I tried to forget what everything was said about it and just read it in context. And over 3 years, I read that book 3 times from cover to cover, and it slowly started making sense. Well, back in the laboratory, I was making much better progress than I was trying to figure out God. I actually finished the experiments in a timely fashion. I was very pleased with our results, and more importantly, my mentor was very pleased. We did not detect gravity waves, Calculations at that time showed that we needed a much, much larger detector, one placed far from noisy technology square. As a matter of fact, we needed 2 detectors so that we could validate and verify that the actual signal came and was celestial in origin. Well, eventually the dream did come true. The largest National Science Foundation project ever funded the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Observatory, or LIGO experiment. There it is. This was a gigantic machine. This one is out in the Washington State. The arms of this interferometer are 4 kilometers long. So sensitive was this machine that it could detect bicycles just bicycling along next to the detector, the pitter-patter of feet. It could detect actually ocean waves and crashing waves 200 miles away, and weather patterns on the other side of the continent. But get this, for 8 full years, this detector, with its sister detector in Louisiana, did not detect gravity waves. It still had too much noise coming in. It wasn't sensitive enough. But perseverance and extra work came and made this thing even more sensitive, so that by 2015, it could now detect movement down to 10 to the minus 19 meters, or movement less than the size of an atomic nucleus. Now it was ready to listen, and indeed, in the past 2 years, it detected 4 collisions attributed to colliding black holes. But the miracle event occurred on the 17th of August of last year, when 2 colliding neutron stars, similar objects that generate gravity waves and simultaneously light waves, was produced and detected. It was a miracle event because conventional telescopes found the light, and this instrument found the gravity waves. It took 50 years from conception to detection. It took a lot of perseverance and a lot of hard work, a little bit of luck getting National Science Foundation funding, certainly. That helps. But no, ultimately, this would not have happened if noise was not reduced to an absolute minimum. The gentleman who was helping me 35 years ago, today, Professor Emeritus Rainer Weiss, actually sent me his greetings from Sweden just after he received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contribution in the detection of gravity waves. I remember working with Ray Weiss, and after I finished that project with him, I went on to graduate. I continued on working in energy, densities, nuclear physics, and eventually energy policy and climate issues, which brought me to the Energy Policy and Climate program today in the AAP of the Krieger School. But during those few years after my work with Ray Weiss, I worked through all the thorny issues involved with the Bible and Christianity. I became a Christian. I realized I didn't have to dumb down any of my thinking. As a matter of fact, when you consider science and God, you have to be a clear thinker. There's no lazy thinking. There's no room for that there. For me, the important thing was to take careful steps. Measure, test, try it, put it into practice, and continue. And perseverance is one of those things that, whether you're faithful or scientific, you have to. It's kind of like knowing something's out there and persevering until you find it. But perseverance is one of those dirty words today that it's difficult. 5 years, 6 years, but 50 years, tough. Consider this. No one would think that gravity waves are not difficult to detect. They're very subtle objects. And general relativity is an extremely abstract concept. But the dynamics of our universe are ultimately controlled through gravity and understood in the framework of general relativity. Now think about the spiritual parallel of that one. I'll leave you with this thought. Wherever you are in your walk today, take time in your busy, noisy life to tune down the noise. And as you do so, think about this. I believe the faint sounds of eternity are always there, and we can hear them as long as we make the effort to turn down the noise. Thank you.